Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I hope you're all well and healthy and hanging in there. Let's crack on with today's fantastic webinar. My name is Sergio Lara Bercial, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's iCoachKids Shares live webinar. This is already our 12th live event, okay? And we're very grateful for you to make the time to join us. Today, actually, a very exciting day because we're going to be talking about decision-making in youth sport with two absolute leaders in this area, Dr. Andy Abraham and Mike Ashford. Both Andy and Mike are colleagues of mine at Leeds Beckett University here in England. And it's super exciting to be talking to them about something that they really know a lot about and something that is really, really important for coaches and participants and players. You may have also seen already, you may know their faces because Andy and Mike were featured in our free online e-learning that is available from our website. So please, I recommend you that you go and check them out there. But before we actually get talking to Andy and Mike, I'm going to introduce the latest addition to the iCoachKids family, Gary Hudson. Gary, can you give us a wave and say hello?
Hi, everyone.
So Gary is our content and community manager, newly appointed into the iCoachKids family, also based at Leeds Beckett University with myself. And Gary, apart from dealing with anything that I don't want to deal with regarding iCoachKids, today will be playing an instrumental role in looking after the questions and making sure that all your queries make it to the floor, okay? Now, speaking of questions, really, let's just really take you quickly through the family rules because we just want to make sure that everybody has a great experience during the webinar. Please, camera and microphone off, as I was saying before, so we can focus on the speakers. Please, please, please don't hesitate to submit questions on the YouTube chat or on the Zoom chat, depending on where you're watching from. Please feel free to share on social media. You've got the handles down there on the background slide. And how we're going to run this? I'm going to introduce the speakers. I'm going to let them present for about 15 minutes each. Then we'll get a conversation going with them, and then we'll open for your questions. Okay. So without further ado, let me introduce the topic first. Today's topic is decision making in youth sport. Sport coaches are faced with the problem of developing players that in any given situation can make decisions that lead to a successful outcome. Research into human decision-making has established three widely accepted perspectives. These will be explored in the webinar alongside a discussion surrounding decision-making in youth sport for both coaches and players. How do coaches make decisions? How can we learn to make better ones? In the background, the decision is whether I kill the dog or not, okay? But never mind, it's going to leave for now. Or how can we support players to become better decision makers in game and perhaps off game? So first I'm going to introduce Andy Abraham. Andy works at Leeds Beckett University, where he's the head of subject for sports coaching. Andy's research and consultancy work is recognized across the world. The impact of this work is seen within the International Sport Coaching Degree Standards, co-produced with the International Council for Coaching Excellence. Academics from universities across continents and practitioners from international coaching federations are using Andy's work on a daily basis. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andy. Andy, welcome and thank you very much for attending iCoachKids call.
Great, thanks, Sergio. If you can stop sharing, I can start sharing. Or...
There we go. And I'm going to mute myself as well so you don't hear the dog.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, thanks very much, Sergio, for that introduction and the invitation to speak. Those of you who know me know I like my rock music, so I thought I'd intrigue you all with this retro Iron Maiden t-shirt. Apparently, Sergio used to listen in the 90s. I'd say he's still 30 years out of date by not still listening now, but there we are. So what Sergio's asked us to do is to look at this idea of what is decision-making. So in terms of both myself and Mike, I said I would look at it in terms of coaching as decision-making, and then Mike's going to start looking at it from what decision-making might look like for players. So I suppose my opening gambit from this would be that this is a very famous saying. It's I think, therefore I am. It's meant to suggest that one of the things which defines humanity and about who we are is our capacity to think, and that the fact is that we can think means that yes, we exist and therefore we are doing things. And things that get done, one of those things is coaching, and I suppose it's no different from any other thing that humans engage in. And I suppose the opening point here is that in order to engage in coaching, you have to think. So I suppose there's the opening statement about why it's useful for us to look at decision-making or coaching as decision-making, because it just requires us to think. We might want to think about what it is that we want to actually think about. So this was a part of the work that went into the international degree standards that Sergio referred to. And it was trying to look at how do primary functions align with skills and align with knowledge. Now, I'm not expecting us to look at all of this for the moment. If you're interested in this, please go on both the paper and the overall document are both freely available online. I'm sure we can link to those later on. The thing I'd like us to look at, if my computer will work, is just this idea of primary function. So this was work that actually Sergio led on with some others to look at, if we were to look at coaching, what are the main things that coaches do? So this talks about setting relevant visions, strategies, creating a good environment, conducting practices, reflecting on performance and engaging in lifelong learning, building positive relationships, and then that last one, which talks about making informed decisions. Now, I would argue that the first 5 of those are reliant on us being able to make informed decisions. And therefore, that, as I keep coming back to, this is why I think it's really helpful for us to consider coaching through that lens in terms of, sorry, I'm just making sure I don't go over time. In terms of trying to work out, well, how do people achieve these primary functions? So there are skills and there are knowledge bases, and I'll come back to knowledge bases in a short while. But it's, if you like, that provides the context against which we can look at decision making for coaches. So coaches need to make decisions in order to achieve those primary functions. If we look at decision making from a relatively simplistic point of view, we might think it'll start with perception. So perception of information. And that perception of information may come through the eyes, it may come through the ears, and it may take the form of watching someone do something, reading something, hearing someone talk. So as you're listening to this and viewing the screen, you're perceiving information through your audio and visual mechanisms. Now, kinesthetic is also another form of perception. Through that perception, we are able to start forming some judgments, and through those judgments, we're able to then start making some decisions. And those decisions then translate into behaviors. So if we take a relatively simple example of, I observe someone kicking the ball, and through that perception, I start to form a judgment that perhaps there is something technically not quite right. So as a result of that, I create a decision to go, right, I need to intervene and perhaps give some feedback to this participant. That feedback then forms the behavior. Now that sounds very mechanistic, and there is a lot more to this, but I'm just trying to offer a relatively simple view of this. But the other simple view is worth considering is sometimes we might also want to think about intuition. And intuition, if you read about that, often talks about it as being relatively unconscious. So therefore, the judgment decision element of it might not always be particularly conscious. So intuition is often referred to as being this idea of perception to judgment or to perception action coupling, but as it's referred to in the dynamical systems literature. So intuition does exist, and we'll perhaps talk about that a little bit later on. So we have that behavior, and then that behavior creates some sort of consequence. The consequence might be in the example I've just talked about, is that person we're giving feedback to starts to change something. And as a result of that change, we might then go back through a perception, judgment, decision, behavior situation again. No, I think this is one of the reasons why it's useful to look at is if we look at the way in which coach development has worked a lot over the past 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of talk around competency. And competency typically focuses on looking at the coach behavior, looking at the decision, at the consequence of that behavior, and forming a judgment about whether or not that coach is competent enough, competent or not. Hopefully, as you look at this, you start to acknowledge that or see that the problem with that is it doesn't necessarily think about or consider the decision which led to that behavior in the first place. So when I've presented this to a good friend now who works for the Football Association, one of the things he talks about is when he started to get into this was he tries not to talk too much to coaches during a session that they deliver, because he's saying by the time they're delivering the session, most of the judgments and decisions have been made prior to that during the planning process. So what he now talks about is actually he's really interested in the planning process to see how that influences what goes on in front of him on the pitch somewhere. So it's one of the reasons why we might question this idea of competency. If we look at this more broadly, therefore, that there isn't just a single decision, there are numerous decisions, and as those continually work on each other in order to achieve consequences which are reflected on and so on. So it becomes almost like a circular process. And if we're looking at this from a research perspective, we might argue as people start to make more and more of those judgments, they're able to start displaying what we perhaps better call professional competence. So they are able to do things like, it's always saying, how would you engage with people to form a strong relationship? Because strong relationships is seen as being a really important professional competence, is your capacity to form those relationships. There is a judgment and decision-making process which goes behind that. So the more we get into that, the more we're able to start moving towards that process. What I've tried to do in this slide is perhaps bring this back to, well, what does this mean for us if we're looking at coaching? So if we look at that top line there, it talks about the common perception of coaching might be plan, deliver, review. Now I've separated plan and review away from deliver, and that's a deliberate reason why I've done that. And that comes from, if we look at the next line down, which talks about this idea of decision-making as being dual processed. And this is the work from Daniel Kahneman, which is very much worthwhile engaging with. That the book that he wrote is really accessible. And what he talks about is, broadly speaking, that humans operate on either a type 1 or type 2 decision-making process. Type 1, he would class as being fast and intuitive. Type 2, he would class as being slow and deliberative. So you perhaps can see why I perhaps align the slow and deliberative with the planning and reviewing element of coaching, and the fast and intuitive with the things that we might have to do when we're delivering in order to perhaps keep up with things that are going on in front of us, to make a fast consideration about what we're seeing in order to offer some feedback. One of the things which I think is really important for us to consider is, how do these two processes and mechanisms talk to each other? Which, if you go back to what I was saying before about the coach educator, he talked about how he's very interested in understanding the planning processes to see how they filter through to the delivery processes. So he's trying to see how coaches are connecting their type 2 decision-making with their type 1 decision-making. One of the things we can also do with this is consider, how long has it taken us to plan? Because if a plan is only being put together in, say, half an hour, the likelihood is it's not being particularly deliberative. And that might be because of constraints. Is that, I coach, and sometimes I only have 1 or 2 hours to perhaps start thinking about what it is I want to go and do with a group of players, because it's a voluntary process. But it's a worthwhile reflection to think, what would this look like if I put more time and effort to it? And I think this is where the next line down, it becomes helpful. This is work from Yates and Shearhart, who split decision-making up actually into 3 areas. The first one they talk about as being analytic, the second one being rule-based, the third one being intuitive or automatic. And I think this is really helpful, because I think it perhaps provides that middle ground. So it may well be that when I'm trying to think about what I'm trying to do with athletes, I become really, really analytic and start to try and collect as much data as I can in order to create a really slow and informed judgment, so that I can be really confident in that judgment. He would then talk about how sometimes we don't perhaps have that time, we're not afforded that time, we need to get on with things quicker, but we still need to have some sense of that, having a think about what we're doing. So he would talk about, these guys would talk about rule-based thinking. So it may well be, if I'm planning a session that is, I want to get the kids interested, I want to get the kids involved, and I want to keep them busy because it's cold and wet and whatever. So those are rules that I might follow in order to start thinking about the sorts of games that I might pull together that I want the people to engage with. So it's an okay process. And finally, he talks about, again, fitting with perhaps what Kahneman talks about, which is we might just have intuitive decision making, which might be that we see something and we react to it something very quickly. And the suggestion is we're more likely to do that when we're emotional. So that might be, again, worthwhile considering as behaviors, touchline behaviors, about how emotions might perhaps start to impact on those. Final line, I've just put in there because, again, it's a very common phrase which is used within coaching, which is reflective practice. If we look at the work of Sean, he talks about reflection on and reflection for practice. And again, if you look at reflection on, we might think about reviewing what we've been doing. A reflection for practice, we might align with that planning process. How do those two things talk to each other? But he also talks about our capacity to reflect in action. So it may be that whilst we're delivering, we're seeing things that we might want to think about. And that might be very intuitive, or it might be, I've got certain rules that I follow and I'm trying to consider what I'm trying to do. And reflection and action, Sean talks about our capacity to experiment in the moment. We're not quite sure if our judgment will achieve what we think it will. So I need to actually have a go. And if it doesn't, then I'll have a go at something else. And if it doesn't, I'll have a go at something else. So he refers to that reflection in action as being about experimenting. But again, where do those experiments come from? And they generally come from the rules that we go into that session with. So if I'm going to examine someone's passing, I might have some certain rules that I've decided these are the important things that I'm going to look for. And I've got some certain ideas about how I might ask the players to change something, but I don't know for certain that those things will happen. So each time I do that, it's a bit of an experiment, and I then get into a reflection action to see whether the experiment's working. So overall, I think that's me trying to offer a view about how that judgment and decision-making works. I'm just going to finish with this idea of, well, what is it we're drawing on? And what Yates and Shearhart talk about is the idea of, are we drawing on formal theory or folk theory? They don't necessarily say one's better than the other, although you might look at these list of ideas and suggest that they are, but there's a recognition that not everything can be always formal and not everything should always be folk. So I think they offer this more in terms of again, as a reflection tool, rather than to say one good, one is bad. That's too dualistic, too black and white. We have to recognize that we're not always in control over the theories that we use. But if we look at formal theory, we might consider the sorts of things that we read that we believe are valid or reliable, that we then bring into ourselves, so it becomes our theory, not someone else's theory. So those theories are ours, they're critically tested by others, but also critically tested by us. On the other hand, we might see folk theory, sorts of things which are handed down generation to generation. They might not always be particularly critically tested. They may not always have a hell of a lot of underpinning rationale. So they might be more rule-based rather than rationale-based. They can lack validity, they can lack reliability, and perhaps one of might be a little bit more a controversial idea is that they might actually restrict creativity, because what we know from creativity is the more we understand why things are the way they are, the more likely we are to see coincidences and contradictions, and those are the sorts of things which tend to generate us being a bit more, why has that happened? So we get into that reflective surprise process, which then might start to drive our creativity. If we don't have all that depth of understanding, we might miss those moments and therefore miss the opportunity to see things in a different way. But there's also the final one, which is we don't do it like that here, which again is a typical folk theory sort of idea. So I think at that moment I will stop. A couple of the things that we perhaps talk about later on, but I think that's probably as good a place to stop as any. So I shall pause there.
Andy, thanks a million. That was terrific. We loads to digest really, and I'm sure we're going to get lots of interesting questions later on. We're going to move on to Mike. So Mike Ashford also works at Leeds Beckett University. Only just, okay, because he's only just got a new position somewhere else, which we are really proud of. And Mike is also looking to complete his PhD shortly. So good luck and well done with that, Mike. I know it's been a really a tough labor of love, really, and well done with that. Mike's PhD is actually titled Defining the Role and Development of Tactics and Decision-Making within Rugby Union. And this area of interest really is mirrored in his teaching in sports coaching. His research aims to highlight what role decision-making has within the sport of rugby to allow for coaches to develop their players' decisions in the most appropriate way. Mike is also a published academic, having recently had his work shared in developing a communal language for decision-making in team invasion sports. So please welcome Mike Ashford. Mike, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that really kind introduction as well. And also to work alongside Andy is obviously one of my supervisors on my PhD, which is always quite pleasant. So yeah, shall I? Yep. Okay. So Andy's really teed decision-making up quite nicely. And I guess I'm only going to work off one slide, so I definitely don't have the resources that the amazing resources Andy had to his disposal there. But I guess what I really want this to become is something that's really practically meaningful for you as coaches or for the academics in the room, is something to go and perhaps provoke some curiosity, or to go and perhaps look at something in a different way, which is really all I'm aiming for in the research that I conduct. And I just want to start on Andy's Descartes quote, "I think, therefore I am." As I think what this is really getting to the root cause of is this idea of rational thought. That as humans, we are graced and we are blessed with the fact that we have rational thought. And I think that is something that I'm really going to try and touch upon as I progress throughout the next 15 minutes, and the fact that that might be a root mechanism in understanding how athletes, how participants or players in a multitude of sports make decisions, which, as we know, is an extremely complex subject area. So before I really want to get into this, I want to start with where my journey began in trying to explore player decision-making, especially within rugby union, and actually started with a very depressed Mike Ashford back in 2015, after England were knocked out of the Rugby World Cup by Australia, after also being beaten by Wales. But what eventually coincided with that tournament is the fact that all of the Southern Hemisphere teams made the semi-final. And there was a great Telegraph article that was titled "Southern Hemisphere Brains Thoroughly Eclipse Northern Hemisphere Brawn." And that really intrigued me. I read the article thinking, oh, they're going to tell me why. What is it about brains versus brawn that really segments and differentiates these two hemispheres of rugby? And I couldn't find anything in there that told me about, one, what decision making was, or two, how it can be best be developed. And so therefore that really provoked my curiosity. And luckily Andy had posted a PhD around the role and development of decision making. How can we understand it in order to better support the development of players? And that really sent me into this PhD, which stupidly, as Sergio said, was titled "Defining the Role and Development of Tactics and Decision Making in Rugby Union," which I can guarantee you I haven't defined. But I think that's the beauty of this subject area. And I just want to start on two quotes. So the way we see the world depends on the lens we look through. And in a subject area like decision making, I think that it can be no more prevalent, that quote. And as we progress throughout the subject areas of what I'm going to discuss, if we put on different lenses, we see the world differently. And what I mean by that is that the literature around decision making has been separated and segmented into three perspectives. The traditional view, or the original view, is suggested to be this information processing idea. Information processing would suggest that, as Andy put so eloquently earlier, we perceive information, we then relate that information to our memory, and within that memory is a mental representation. And I will define a mental representation as an internal depiction of an external reality, and then use that mental representation to make a decision that then leads to a consequence. So very similar in the mechanisms that Andy discussed earlier from a coaching point of view. So that's one perspective, information processing. The more contemporary perspective, as Carl Woods has recently titled it, is Ecological Psychology, or from a decision-making point of view, Ecological Dynamics. And this theory is relatively dominant in the area of decision-making at the moment. And it would suggest that perception and action can't be separated from the demands of the environment. So if we think of a sport as a task with an environment and with an organism or an individual, it suggests that the information that is being derived from that environment and from that task cannot be separated from the action, and that decisions then become emergent, absent of mental representations. So that internal store that's included in memory isn't there, and instead it's a lot more of an embodied process in the fact that our action capabilities, so what we can do technically and physically, directly allow us to see and perceive what is going on in the environment. So you might hear the statement thrown around quite often, perceive to move and move to perceive, in a reciprocal fashion. And then finally, perhaps a mediating variable, but is underpinned by the information process and perspective, is this idea of naturalistic decision-making, which is very much embodied in what Andy discussed earlier from Daniel Kahneman's work, in the fact that people make decisions and players or participants make decisions based on an assessment and a recognition of the information that is being presented to them. And this all hinges on the idea of typicality. So how typical is that information to me as a decision maker? So if it is extremely typical, then we tend to rely on what Andy called intuition. We tend to provide a simple match between the information and what my action capabilities allow. But then if that information becomes atypical, it starts to become more foreign, or things change, or our expectations change, then we are likely to have to diagnose the information that's available in front of us in order to come to an action. So in other words, we might have to go to our internal memory, access mental representation, and come to an action. And then finally, level 3, so level 1, 2, and now 3. Information may be typical, but it may have a huge consequence that's aligned to it. So in other words, we might have to evaluate and mentally rehearse the possible actions that we might take in order to come to a decision. So recognition prime decision making, which is the naturalistic point of view, would suggest that there are 3 levels, which is simple match, diagnosis, and evaluation, that are dependent on the typicality of the information available. So realistically, what I'm going to talk about now is that there are well over 60 terminologies that have been used to describe decision making in team sports alone. And I found this extremely complex, extremely convoluted. And alongside this, the implications that have been offered to coaches are quite contradictory and quite confusing. And that, referring back to the article that Sergio mentioned at the start, that was really the purpose behind the communal language paper. So what I'm going to do now is, with those 3 perspectives, is I'm going to offer the perspective I've created throughout my PhD, along with Andy and Jamie Poulton, and really offer some insight on how we can perhaps better understand our players or our athletes or our participants' decision-making in order to better support the way we develop their decision-making. So first things first is, information can only be born from the game or the task itself. And what I really want to touch upon here is the idea of the uniqueness of game forms if we're looking at participants below the age of 13, or in particular sports if we're looking at the participants above 13. So the reason why I've used those age categories is in accordance with Cote's developmental model of sport participation, is that it would suggest that around 13, 14, we begin to specialize and then invest in particular sports. And before that, we might consider game forms, so invasion, net wall, as more prevalent in considering the information that's being presented to a player or an athlete. And the reason why I really want to focus on the game as a start point is every game has a set of rules and a pre-illusory goal. So that pre-illusory goal might be to score more points than your opponent, to take 20 wickets, to execute a routine in its perfect form without losing too many difficulty points, so on and so forth. So that in its entirety demands what information is then produced to a player, and we can't ignore that. And I think under 13 we should begin to experiment with those laws, because all invasion sports, for example, have the same pre-illusory goal, which is to outscore your opponent. So we might make it multi-directional. We might not have our sidelines, but we're still keeping the game in its truest form to that game form of invasion games, which then transcend more into rigid rules and unique games. And that's where the player then comes in. So we've been presented this game that has a pre-illusory goal and a set of constitutive rules. That then creates a legal suite of actions or decisions that can never be done at any one time. And that's really important, because decision-making, therefore, is defined by the rules and by the goal of the game, as I find it very unlikely, unless they're doing something completely illegal, that anyone would try and make a decision to move away from the pre-illusory goal. So I also want to touch upon the context of which you're working in. So just to refer on Dave Collins' work around the 3 worlds continuum, it's really important to consider what context the individual athlete is considering. So are they participating for their personal well-being? Are they there for personal reference excellence? Or if they're in a talent identification and development environment, are they there for elite reference excellence? Because again, that might segment the way you perceive game forms to a particular unique sport. Now, alongside this, as the rules and the pre-illusory goal interact, they create information and relevant information for players, for athletes to identify and perceive. So therefore, decision-making for me in its simplest form is simply an interaction between the perception of information and possessing and acting upon the individual and the collective capability to act on that information in the first place. And you might have heard earlier what Andy was discussing, the idea of mechanisms. And this is extremely important, as we said before, with the 3 perspectives, they differ all the differences hinge upon this idea of mental representation. Again, an internal image of an external reality. And that the presence or absence depends on those theoretical beliefs or the lens we look through. And I would segment these into actions for, knowledge of, and knowledge in the game or the sport. Actions for refers to the technical and physical capabilities one possesses in order to act on information. So from an ecological perspective, the higher and more competent your technical and physical capabilities are, the more you'd see and the more you'd be able to act on those invitations for action. But then from an information processing perspective, we have this idea of declarative knowledge and knowledge of the game or knowledge of the sport, where a deep and embedded understanding of why an action is most appropriate allows experts to become excellent decision makers. So these 2 contrasting beliefs, realistically, I think should be embedded and connected together, where athletes' physical and technical requirements are continuously being developed alongside a declarative piece and an understanding of why those actions are most prevalent given the game information that is being derived by the environment. But then we cannot always plan for what information is going to come. We can't always intend to behave in a particular way. And as we know, sports and a multitude of sports throw up environments where we are required to do something different than what we expected. So from a recognition prime decision-making point of view, we are required to diagnose or evaluate if that situation offers us the time to do so. And I think this is really important, as what you need to consider is how do we allow for those moments with our athletes in order to have a real rigid declarative understanding of why actions are most important, but then also be able to diagnose and strategize when things don't necessarily go their way. So all those mechanisms that are derived from the 3 perspectives, I think are constantly ebbing and flowing between, depending on the situation of the sport. And that's really what I want to finish on, is if we as coaches can truly understand the moments that our athletes are going to face, then we can best start to consider what actions for the game are most appropriate, what suite of actions are required. So passing, movement, fundamental movement skills, sport-specific skills, functional movement skills, depending on the age and stage of the participant, or more strategic skills. So if you think in rugby union, like a line out, how are we going to educate them on the throw? Then at the same time, we might have to support the development of knowledge of and declarative knowledge, whilst also considering the game moments that are going to throw incidents that we don't expect. So supporting them to have the knowledge in the game to diagnose and evaluate, to come to an appropriate decision. And what we've found through our research is that this seems dependent on the situation that the game itself offers. So a game such as rugby union, that was the vehicle we used for our PhD, is such a phase-like game where the rules demand completely different solutions at any given time. If you think kickoff, a scrum, a line out, open phase play, and attack and defense, which create different amounts of complexity, different amounts of time, and different amount of options for decision makers. So if time is minimal, then they might rely on their actions for the game in an implicit perception action process. Whereas time increases, we might rely more on deliberative, evaluative processes to come to decisions. And we might then resemble our coaching based on those mechanisms. So if time is available, options are available, and complexity is high, then we might offer solutions to players through intentional strategies. Whereas if time is minimal and complexity is low, then we might consider using more incidental strategies like more game-based practice and more emergent discovery-based practices. So I'll finish there really. I've thrown a lot from one slide, Sergio. So if we want to open it up to the floor, that'd be great.
All right, Mike, fantastic. Mike, if you don't mind, there we go, fantastic. Wow, listen, fantastic. Lots to get our teeth into really for the next 20-25 minutes. And I'm gonna start with a question for Andy first, okay? Or for both, really, because I would really like to encourage you to, as I ask questions, really to make this much more of a conversation rather than me asking questions, really. So if you want to chip in at any time when the other person is answering their question, that's fantastic. Andy, one thing that that you mentioned at some point, and it was kind of a little bit like in passing, but that I think is really important, is the idea of the role that emotions have in decision making. Okay, and that kind of made me think about, all right, so you both have given us a really good grounding on what decision making is about, really. But what are the pitfalls of decision making? What do people, or is that I know that's a difficult question, but what do we know about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't claim to be a completely major area of expertise, and I think it would be really useful for us to perhaps look at that, especially if we look at touchline behaviours. But if you get into the idea of emotional decision making, and again, if you get into Kahneman's book, Kahneman talks about actually there are moments when emotional decision making is actually really good for us. And the evidence would point to things like buying a house, for example. So the evidence would talk about that people tend to make better emotional decisions with that sort of experience. And it's probably the same as perhaps in terms of finding our partners, buying cars, the sorts of things that are going to bring us more, I don't know, perhaps some element of joy, or the, no, I'm not suggesting coaching shouldn't bring us joy, but there are times with that. But equally, if you to look at, I mean, the most obvious that we're all probably sat here being very aware of it is you just have to look at some of the stuff that goes on Twitter land, and I'm as guilty as anyone else in terms of we get caught up in the moment of being responsive, and it's almost like that. My colleague Steve McKeown would call it being the reptilian brain, feeling like it's being attacked and it wants to get back quickly. You know, so it's this idea of someone being burned. You know, that sort of nonsense that goes on Twitter. You know, he's really burned you there. And you're going, well, if someone's burned you, it generally means that they probably haven't. They haven't really thought through what they're trying to say, and actually burning someone like that might actually come back to harm you further down the line. So the idea of emotional decision-making, it typically pulls us into that more reactive, intuitive, automatic, naturalistic, quick responses. And there's times when that might be really useful for us, and there's times when that might be horrendous for us. And part of the trick is allowing your type 2 brain to tell you sometimes, leave it alone, walk away. So again, most of us at some point will have written an email, and if we've ever been, if we've allowed our type 2 brain to talk to us, we'll have gone, save, put it in drafts, come back to it in a day's time and read it and go, yeah, I'm glad I didn't send that. But equally, you might come back in a day's time and go, no, I'm still comfortable with what I'm saying there. And actually, the emotionality is actually quite important. I think it's important that the person who receives that understands the emotionality. But the point is, you put the pause in, just like you paused in front of me, Sergio. So I don't know if it's gone down, hopefully not. So that's where probably I would start in terms of that emotionality idea.
I guess I'll add on to that, Andy, whilst Sergio's doing his best robot impression. I think just from a player point of view, I'll draw upon my final study of my PhD with the coaches, which we're coming back to this idea of folk theory and folk pedagogy, in the idea that the coaches all sort of centered on this idea of confidence and self-efficacy whilst making decisions. 2, overcoming challenges and taking ownership of those challenges. But then finally 3, and perhaps most importantly, as Andy was saying, that they kind of presented the same concepts under the idea of emotional intelligence, in the fact that they identified decision-making expertise in their players. So this is Premiership coaches. They identified that they were able to remain calm regardless of the situation. So even when the momentum, offensive or defensive momentum, was going against them, these players were able to make the same decisions regardless of the impression and momentum that was coming from the game situation. And so I think the answer is kind of the same there, in the fact that, can you remain calm? Can you be emotionally intelligent? But then also, can you be confident and remain confident in the judgments and the decisions that you're making regardless of the situation? So I think that's just a real nice example where perhaps the folk pedagogy and the folk beliefs towards their coaching practice really aligns well to the literature that already exists.
Sorry guys, I'm back. The joys of BT. Okay. Listen, I mean the idea of making decisions in the spur of the moment and emotional decisions, that's something that it really appeals to me, because when I think about all the decisions I've made in the past, particularly coaching ones, but not only coaching, when something's gone wrong, it's definitely been because, as you were saying, Andy, the reptilian brain was kind of taking over really, and the red mist clouded my judgment really. So that's something that's really important. Now, the other thing that has been really helpful, yeah, it's been an eventful day in the Lara Bertial household. But the other thing that's been really interesting for me, listening to you and reading your work, is the idea of the importance of having a frame of reference. Okay, and you've both mentioned it from different angles really, but you both really talked about the importance of, you can't really make decisions without having a frame of reference. So can we talk a bit more about the idea of the frame of reference? What goes into a frame of reference? How do we build one, and why is it that important? So I'm going to go back to Mike first, and then Andy, you can chip in whenever.
I suppose from being biased here and drawing upon team sports, is that the demands of the game in rugby or in football demand that a multitude of players all head towards the same performance goal. So that might be in the elite form of the game to score more points than your opponent, or it might be in a developmental mode of the game to act out a particular form of tactical strategy that they haven't tried before. So they might try playing out from the back, for instance, in football. And I think what's really important from a common frame of reference is that the coach and the players, from my point of view, all share, 1, the same mechanisms, 2, the same performance goal, and 3, the ability to see, communicate, and act and reflect in a similar way. Because then with that just becomes coherence and alignment. And alongside a common frame of reference, one of the most important mechanisms and factors with that is having a language that then supports that coherence and alignment. So a common language that supports 1, perception, 2, decisions, and 3, actions, and then 4, also, and perhaps most importantly, reflection. So for instance, they might have tried to play out from the back twice. They're getting high pressed and they're being turned over. Are they resilient enough to continue with that strategy because they know it's a developmental strategy and that they are going to concede goals? Or are they going to adapt and strategically to find a different solution to that environment? And I think if the common frame of reference allows for that fluidity and adaptability, then it's just a really good example of how that shared frame of reference can really be beneficial.
Thanks, Mike. Andy, any comment on that or any additions?
Well, firstly, just to agree with what Mike said, so we might talk about this idea of a mental model. You know, what is it that if we make a judgment, how do we know it's a good judgment? Now, you can wait for the consequence, but one of the things that we would talk about a lot, especially if you look at the press, is this idea of hindsight bias. As in, you read these things written in newspaper articles. Was it the right judgment? Only time will tell. You go, no, only time won't tell. It's either a good judgment or it isn't. You know, that you can't decide whether something's good in hindsight, because why would someone make a poor judgment? You know, it doesn't. When you get into it, it doesn't make sense. People will make judgments in good faith. And I think often that's one of the things we have to remember is people make judgments in good faith. Now, it doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean you can't go back and go, but if we have to make that judgment again, we might make it differently. You know, so we can use hindsight to inform future judgments, but we can't use it to change past judgments unless you've got a time machine or, you know, you've got a flux capacitor. You might have one, Sergio, I don't know, that might be something you have. But I think going back to what Mike's saying, because I think it reflects one of the questions that Rusty's asked in the chat there about the slide where I've put up those different words for decision making. Again, that's to me, there's 2 things which go on there. One, reflect what Mike said, is it offers a common language, and often language is used in different ways by different people. So if you can match language across perspectives to basically say, look, these are saying the same thing, then that brings clarity, which I think is really important. So that would be the answer to one of the things that Rusty's asked, but also, you know, clarity is one of the things we look for in terms of a framework. You know, there's that phrase, make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. But also, any fool can take something complex and make it more difficult. It takes a genius to make it simpler. You know, so creating clarity is really important to allow us to get a sense of, we know why we're doing what we're doing. And that why bit is, if we look at human autonomy, how do we give people autonomy? We give them ownership over their own behavior. Now, if they don't always know how their own behavior works, which is, you know, why would they, until someone actually perhaps presents that to them, then again, that autonomy then drives curiosity, which then hopefully drives learning. So to answer Rusty's question, that slide has been used to try and offer clarity, but also give people the framework against which they can start reflecting on their own work. And, you know, it's been presented to some of the people on the chat here. So in terms of programs, and they might be better suited to answer some of the rest of his question about how has it impacted. So I think the framework is crucial, but what we shouldn't allow a framework to do is limit what we think. And that's probably the downside of going down a framework process, is it starts to create boundaries around which we think, rather than saying, just recognize this framework is only as good as it is at the moment. Let's keep going for creativity. Let's keep looking for ways in which this might adapt. Or if you go with, Dave Piggott was here, would talk about Kuhn, who says that science goes in leaps and bounds, so things might change bit by bit by bit. And somebody comes on and goes, yeah, that's a load of nonsense. We need to do it like this. And suddenly everything changes again. So we need to keep an open mind with things as well.
I just want to attach on to that, Andy. Something's really resonated with me there around the interactions when we have a common frame of reference with athletes. And what I mean by this is how often as coaches do we impress our frame onto the players without considering theirs first, which I think when we're seeking to develop decision-making is a really important concept, in that have we empathized or seek to understand why that person has made that decision before impressing our own belief onto it. So in other words, have we identified the problem first before coming to the solution? And I think if a frame of reference is produced as a scaffold or an impression of strategy rather than a prescribed model, that is when those conversations can happen most fluidly and perhaps most beneficially. So yeah.
But Mike, that's a really good point, really, because I mean, you both made some really interesting points around the notion of. I mean, I always, because I'm as a coach, I have a very strong framework, okay, of the way I understand my game and the way I understand my game for currently a bunch of 14-year-olds, okay, and that would be different if they were 18 or senior players, okay, but actually, I've really over the years realized that the beautiful thing about having the framework is that then allows me to go outside the framework, and also the players, I keep saying to the players, look, it's just a framework, and I use that word, a framework, for you to be generally in good situations that then you have to exploit with your own creativity. Okay, so the framework actually, for me, and this has not always been the case, okay, but I think I've come to that point where for me the framework is all about getting everybody on the same page, so then they can be creative, as opposed to being creative within a chaos situation. Okay, I think because the game is chaotic enough, the game will destroy your framework anyway all the time. That's the way I see it, really. I was watching a video, Marcelo Bielsa, the Leeds United coach. Okay, and it was a 90-minute video that where he was presenting around the different schemes, the different shapes of football, 4-4-2 and all that, and he kept saying, but you know what? And he was in Spanish, right? He was being really funny. He was saying, it doesn't matter because I put them in that picture in the 4-4-2, but the bastards keep moving. Okay, and you just have to equip them with the tools to be able to move and to make those decisions where they need to go somewhere because they need to react to what's happening in the field. Okay. I'm going to hand over to Gary and see what questions. I know you've probably answered some of those as you were going through that last bit of comments, but Gary, any questions there that we can pose to Mike and Andy?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I'll go to James on YouTube first. So James has asked, with more and more pressure on youth sport coaches, how can coaches expedite decision-making during games while keeping the fun?
One for you, Mike.
Nice, I like that. Well, I think again the easiest way to consider that is finding the right amount of challenge, whilst also considering that, as Andy said before, no one makes a decision purposefully to be wrong. So always praise a decision and then consider the outcome. I think it's a really important way to go about that. So my advice always is if you can start by saying and considering and understanding why that decision was made in that time and making a reference to that, then you've already got the player or the participant off guard. They're already relaxed. And then if you can offer some feedback or then begin to consider maybe an intervention around why the outcome didn't then occur in the way that it should have done, then that might be a way of going about it. But it all comes down to the behavior and the way you frame that response. If it's in quite a scold-like manner where you're literally you're impressing it onto the player, then the likelihood is that fun's going to diminish pretty quickly. Whereas if you make it feel like it's in its environment where it's okay to make those decisions and feel the freedom to make those decisions, knowing that you're likely to make mistakes, then it's still likely to be fun. Obviously, we've got an external element, which is parents, and we have to get them on board with that as well, which is a huge task in itself. But I do think that behavior can go a long way in order to do that.
Just to
that, Mike.
Go on, Andy.
Just to add to that, so Mike, I think you've offered a really useful sort of idea in terms of in that moment, in that coaching delivery moment. But I think it's actually, in addition to that, there's a very big question in there, which is one of the reasons why we'll talk about the point of planning and analytic thinking. Is one of the things that I think that isn't perhaps always done as well as it could be, is being clear about what do you want, when, and how long is it going to take. You know, the idea that we want everything tomorrow, or is often one of the things which I think more experienced coaches will go, but that won't happen. Now, if people are under pressure to feel like all people need to improve the decision by tomorrow, then there's perhaps a stand back question. Go, look, why do we think that? Where do we think this person should be by this time? One of the things that I would perhaps talk about is that, you know, generally speaking, in team sports, we might see people reaching their absolute peak some point towards in their late 20s. Now, I'm not going to point to evidence for that, but that's typically, I think we would probably say that if you look at the best players in the world, they've generally got to that point, some point in their late 20s in team sports. If you think about that, for the majority of those players, they've probably taken that sport up as a, let's say, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's a chance that they've been engaging in that sport for nearly 20 years by the time we're saying they're hitting their peak. So, you know, so if we're looking at a 13-year-old who isn't going to be a Messi or Ronaldo, then, you know, what are they going to achieve in the next 2 years, especially if they're training twice a week? You know, it's maybe if we're looking at academy players in football, that they might be 3 or 4 times a week. If you look at other sports, it might be less than 2 times a week. In fact, it might be once a month or something. They get together as an academy. So I think it's one of the things that one of our colleagues would talk about would be saying, what are the threshold concepts that we expect people to reach before we can push them on again? And generally speaking, I think it's just try and reach a view. Now, there's not going to be an exact answer to this question in the literature. So this is where Sean would talk about, well, you're now going to have to set up an experiment. Let's put our best guess on paper, create a plan around that best guess, and let's start monitoring it and see how it actually how it develops. Now, it might be we get places quicker, or it might be we get places slower, and because of non-linearity, it might speed up and then slow down, and you know. So I think all we can do is put our best foot forward and then monitor as best we can in that sort of experimental idea, using our judgments to monitor and then reflect and think about what are we going to do next. So it's a tough question, but I think sometimes when the first answer is let's just be realistic here. What are we going to achieve in the time we've got?
And just to attach onto that, it really resonates with me with this idea when if we start, say, with a common frame of reference around a tactical strategy that we want to impress onto the players, we've got to consider whether those players have the technical and physical capabilities to fulfill that tactical strategy in the first place. And that can often be when you see the main mistakes. So if you're not able to identify that, then that can be a real issue for development. So it's as Andy was saying, it's the reflection in action piece to identify that I've asked this group of individuals or individual to perform this strategy without considering whether their technical and physical action capabilities meet those demands. And I think that's a real life example where what Andy was discussing there really comes to the fore.
I guess that leads really nicely onto a question from Eric, who has kind of suggested that in Asian countries, a lot of players are really used to getting solutions from an external source. And And Eric's asked, is there any suggestions on accelerating the process, or building on Eric's point there? Is there kind of ways to get players more used to making those decisions and spotting those problems and making those experiments?
I think one solution I will give in an offer is from a coach that I've worked with over my PhD, and the fact that it comes back to the idea of autonomy. So as Andy highlighted, it's just autonomy is simply giving ownership or control. And it tends to be misconstrued as this idea that they have complete ownership. And I think when people are, let's be honest, if we look at the cultural implications of coaches I've discussed in working in places like Japan or China in a rugby context, players like being told what to do at times. So at the same time, if you want players to start taking ownership, then you can simply frame it in a different way, where you offer the solution, but you make them feel as though they came up with it. And I think that's a real nice way of offering autonomy in its truest form, but still offering it. And then they feel comfortable with having come up with something themselves. And then, as Andy says, you've broken that threshold concept, that cognitive threshold concept, because they now feel comfortable offering their own solutions. And then it's simply about adding layers and creating more learning opportunities for that to occur.
Just to add to that, there was a really nice paper released recently by Amy Price and Dave Collins, where they looked at how well do coaches support the development of strategic decision-making in, I think it was in football. So this idea that players don't need to look to the bench to work out when things are starting to go wrong on the pitch, how do they change it? And one of the suggestions with that was, with the research, was that actually that wasn't often an explicit part of the coaching program. So I can see Vicky's asking about the engagement of the learner within these sorts of things. I think I'm wary of this term athlete-centered coaching for a number of reasons, because I think it's a fluid process. You know, if we look at research, directed learning is typically found to be the most effective form of teaching. But we might then consider the context within which we find that. Now, if we want people to become strategic and being able to feel like they've got the opportunity to influence the game they're playing, then we have to give them the opportunity to do that. But to do that without giving them some framework to do that means that we're asking them to do that within we're almost setting them up to fail. So I think it's that idea of, well, in fact, almost goes back to Vygotsky's view of zone of proximal development, is take someone where they're not going to be able to get on their own, show them that they can get there, then scaffold their capacity to get there by themselves. And as that scaffolding goes on, you should be able to release them further and further to actually take more and more ownership over that. But if we then go to threshold concepts, you might then go, right, now it's time to introduce a new idea about, which is going to be really difficult for you, it's going to confuse you. So it might become more directive again, and then it becomes we release you. So I don't think when we get into this, it's this or it's this, it's not. Relativism talks about the judgment a coach has got to make is dependent on what they're trying to achieve and what part of the process they're in order to do that. So I think, learning engagement is clearly always crucial. If we lose the learner, then we're probably telling you, if you don't do this, you're not going to pass, which is classic. Like my son saying, I don't like French, but you're going to have to do it because of your GCSEs and that, it might come back to bite if you don't do it. So it's a pretty horrible extrinsic reason to do it when you'd think it'd be much nicer as an intrinsic reason to do it. But so I think it's great if we can encourage people to take ownership, but actually, again, those of you, with coach, we know that some people want that and other people don't. So in fact, being athlete-centered with that person who doesn't want to have that responsibility would be to say, right, well, just do this, because that's what they want. So, it's again, as ever, it's complex.
So, sorry, go on, Mike.
Sorry, I just saw a great practical example of this of a coach I'm working with who was looking at a single phase practice, attack and defense. The attack were overloaded and the defense were trying to shut them down. And it was like a gamification where you had to go from stage 1 to stage 4 And every time on stage 4, when they'd satisfied the demands of the task, he kept asking them over and over again to do something different. Show me something new, do something different. And the best interaction, therefore, came when they did something different. They satisfied the problem, but then they reflected on why that solution was beneficial. So as an example of that then empowers the players or provides them with autonomy to think, we came up with that just then. And then the coach asked them, do you want to keep it? Do you want to keep that as a solution, as a tactical solution? I just think that's a real nice example of how something so structured and something given to them can then be added on with this idea of autonomy.
But I think, I mean, that's, to me, there's a couple of really important points there. One is the idea of the role of the coach as building the scaffold that is going to allow them to progress. Because it always makes me giggle a little bit when I hear people talk about, oh, we have to let the players discover the game. And I'm thinking, yeah, but the game is too complex, right? I mean, coaches spend 40, 50 years trying to work out the game, and we expect children to work it out by themselves. We need to break it down to the levels of complexity that they can handle, really. Really support them in that. So we, like Andy said, with this idea of the more capable other at that point that you are, okay? But then kind of alongside that, I mean, Mike, you talked a lot earlier on in your presentation around the idea of building the declarative knowledge, okay? Which I think is underdone. You know, we don't do it enough. And I think for me, it's something that's really important. Back to Amy Price. Amy Price was presenting here last week or the week before. And because of one of her recommendations, really, I ended up looking at one of the books that she recommended, really, around the how video games designers really engage with the players, really, and they talk about the idea of metacognition a lot in video games, that the children need to understand the internal logic of the game for them to be able to play the game and enjoy it. Okay, and I think sometimes we don't do well enough that when we're coaching, really, we don't help children understand that internal logic of the game to be able to talk about the game, not just play it. I don't know, thoughts on that?
Well, I was hoping you were going to say video games called the radio star, but that was something. Yeah, I would just agree. So, sure, I don't think I've got anything else to add to that.
I think for me, the only thing I can really add to it is that kids at the moment in a multitude of sports aren't watching the sport. And I think that is a fundamental issue. So, and then I'm not slamming coach education over the past 10 or so years, but we have moved more towards a preference towards more game-based, fun-based, and perhaps conflated practice structure to enjoyment, rather than really focusing on the game itself. And that's what I was trying to get at in this idea. The uniqueness of the game needs to be appreciated in order to understand decision-making. And the why, I've read a significant amount of papers throughout my PhD, and the most common across perspectives is this idea that people need to understand why something is important given the situation. Even from an ecological dynamics perspective, they talk about intention. Those intentions are still derived from a wider knowledge of why. And I think it's perhaps the root of expertise in decision making.
Great stuff. Gary, any further questions?
Yeah, one from Jamie here, and I'm going to kind of precede this question with just reminding everybody that Mike and Andy are both active coaches as well as top academics. So just leading into Jamie's question there, have you guys come across or done any good examples where teams or individuals have explored opportunities to think slowly during play and during practice?
I've tried it for various reasons. I've tried it to that depth once, where I was able to, so just give you some context, I coach once a week, and then we have a game on a Sunday, and that coaching once a week is basically in a field. I mean, it might get called a rugby pitch, but it's essentially a field. There's no other facilities there. So when it's wet and cold, there's not really any opportunity to do much slow off-field work. Perhaps at the beginning of the season, I might give them a few more whiteboards to get them to sketch down some ideas about some of the things they might want to do, but the nature of the sport doesn't always help that. Now, if we had an indoor space, I would do much more of it. To the extent I think I could get them far more curious about the game if we were able to look at the game a bit more from that slow perspective. Not all of them, but I think, going back to what Mike was saying about the PPW, PRE, ERE. So I have done it once where I was able to get the clubhouse, which is away from where the training facilities are. And we just got 3 iPads with some video footage lined up and asked them to look at it and just to ask them what they were seeing. Players were given the opportunity to decide whether they want to turn up because it wasn't a practice session because the pitches were too wet. And it was interesting to me, the players who chose to turn up and those who didn't turn up. So yes, I have done that. And it actually, if you can get it right, if you can get it set up properly and set the problem properly, it worked really nicely. But I just don't have the time facilities to do it, unfortunately, and I'd love to do more of it.
I think I'm blessed in adult rugby union in the fact that it's probably the most stop-start sport in the world, apart from American football, and that ball in play will only ever exceed 45 minutes out of an 80-minute game, which is a shame, but that is, again, the uniqueness of the sport itself. But every set piece gives you an opportunity to be deliberative, to think slow, because you get to see a still frame and then create a decision around that still frame, which is why a lot of coaches will use very directional tactical strategies around set piece. But then there are also moments where we consider momentum and that players know that the game's getting away from them, but sometimes they don't have the time to consider why it's getting away from them. So we're lucky to be mic'd up, and we have what we'd call a POR, where our tight head prop will fake an injury, go down, offer a water break opportunity where they take 3 breaths, bring themselves back down to baseline, and then consider a new solution that's going to get some positives on the board. Again, just a simple example of where they can be quite deliberative with their own knowledge of the game and start to consider. So Stuart Lancaster will talk about a momentum graph where you have a tick or a cross. And if you have too many crosses, eventually you'll concede. So what can you do in that short period of time to think, to diagnose, and to just simply get a tick on the board? And I think that's a real nice example of just how you can be deliberative in such a fast-paced environment.
Yeah, if I can just chip in there, Gary. I mean, that's been one of the biggest revelations of lockdown, really, and not being able to train together. So we've normally done a lot of that work on the court because we are blessed with playing indoors, so we can stop whenever we want, and we do spend a lot of time, what we call player timeouts, player strategy fights, whatever you want. But actually during lockdown, because we couldn't get together, what we ended up doing every Monday, we've been watching videos on Zoom together. So some of them have been our own games, some of them have been classic games, some of them have been games from the Europeans, so they can see the level they aspire to. And the message from the boys is they actually love doing that kind of thing. They really enjoy, I mean, bear in mind, the kids that I coach have an ambition of becoming professional basketball players or playing for Great Britain, so they're very committed. But they just love that idea of learning more about the game. And I think it's invaluable, really, when you see them, how well they understand some ideas and how that actually impacts on the decisions they make, really. Not only decisions in game, but decisions in terms of how they train or other things, really. So I would really encourage people to do a lot more of that.
I have to give you some credit there, Sergio. I think that love for the sport that's been shown in them is probably a reflection of your enthusiasm and love for the sport in the first place.
Thanks, Mike.
I do. I think if we can show that enthusiasm, it's more likely to get people engaged with watching the sport and creating that love and enjoyment and enthusiasm for it, which I think is huge. So, yeah.
All right, on that brotherly, on that bromance note, we're gonna leave it there, guys. Mike, Andy, thanks a million for giving up your time to take us through all of these. Gary, thanks a million for all the work behind the scenes to make it happen. And everybody watching, stay safe, stay connected, and keep it up. Okay, thanks everyone. See you soon.
Cheers, guys. Thanks.